Hello, and a very warm welcome to the channel. It is great to be back. Now, I'm very excited for today's video. Not that I'm not usually excited, but I'm particularly excited because this is a history reaction and I am a complete history nerd, if you know me at all. So this is the history of Texas in 11 minutes from the Knowledgia channel. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right, by the way. Knowledgia, to be clear, not Texas. I'm pretty confident about that one. So I know Texas is a particularly fascinating state because, of course, it was an independent country for, I believe, 10 years between becoming independent from Mexico, to the Texan Revolution, the Alamo, all that good stuff, and joining the United States. So I think it's clearly got a really, really interesting history, but I don't know the details. So I'm really excited to get into this one. If you haven't subscribed already, please do. It really helps the channel. If you haven't subscribed already, I'm getting into the Texas slang. And yeah, I hope you enjoy. Let's go.
Home of the fastest road in the USA, the largest state capitol building in the nation.
I've heard the Texas Capitol is actually bigger than the Capitol in Washington, D.C. If you're from Texas, I'd be grateful if you could confirm that.
And a mass bigger than any country in Europe, Texas has a history
Except
almost
Russia,
as large as everything in it. The history of the great state of Texas technically begins at around 9,200 BC at least. Paleo-Indians were the early inhabitants of the territory, and by the first AD years...
Oh, well, I mean, that animal looks terrifying. It looks like a cross between a giant armadillo with like the head of a beaver. Is that a real thing? Because that's incredible.
Texas boasted a considerable indigenous population already. By the time the North American continent began to be colonized, there were about 6 main native cultural groups in Texas alone. This meant that the fate of the early European colonists would depend vastly on how the locals responded to their presence.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The first European explorer to map the Texas Gulf Coast was Alonso Alvarez de Pineda in 1519, although it wouldn't be for nearly another decade until a Spaniard actually journeyed into the North American interior, and thus Texas. This next expedition began in 1528 under the lead of Pánfilo de Narváez, but
So it's incredible that by this point Spain already controlled, by the look of things, nearly the whole Caribbean and pretty much all of modern day Mexico before they even sort of found time to venture into the interior of Texas.
Turned into an utter disaster. Hurricanes and savage storms battered the expedition and sunk 2 of the fleet's ships, killing already a good chunk of the initial 600 men. The survivors were still aimed for a landing in modern-day Tampico, Mexico, but as luck would have it, they were instead blown off course toward Florida, not far off from today's Tampa Bay. Now, Narváez...
I mean, it's kind of ironic that we think of the Caribbean, Florida, as being like a near paradise. So beautiful weather, beautiful beaches. I mean, maybe some bits of Caribbean still have political problems, but if you went back 300-400 years, it was basically a death trap for Europeans. If you were a French or a British soldier and you got sent to the Caribbean, there's a pretty good chance you're going to die of a horrible disease. And there's nothing you'd be able to do about it. It was just you had to follow orders. Because, of course, particularly in the Caribbean, the sugar colonies were so financially beneficial that the kind of allowing the deaths of some low-ranking soldiers, or a lot of low-ranking soldiers, was worth it.
To divide his troops into 2 groups, one on land and one still on the ships, to explore the northern coast of Florida. These expeditions were intended to meet up once more at an unspecified harbor, but yet again, the plan would fail. There was no harbor where the fleet could dock, and the 300 who had traveled by land were under siege from the local indigenous tribes, as well as from starvation and disease. These explorers were dying by the masses now.
Yeah, that's the thing about disease.
Only a few months later, around 90 remained. Conditions were no better than thus far, however, and when the final group of explorers were swept onto Galveston Island, they were swiftly abducted by the natives, and more would continue to succumb to disease, starvation, and now the harsh conditions of their new situation. 8 years later, 90 became 4. Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, Andres Dorantes de Carranza and his slave Estevanico, and Alonso del Castillo Maldonado were the only remaining members of Narvaez's journey. The final survivors attempted on their own to explore what they could of the modern southwestern portion of the United States and the very top of Mexico.
It's an astonishing journey. Some proper like Lewis and Clark type expedition.
But they would soon join ranks with a group of slave catchers
That's
found
not
in
good.
Sinaloa in 1536. Finally, the expedition would reach Mexico City, and eventually the few survivors left returned to their Spanish homes. The French, however, were no less interested than Spain.
The French.
While the Spaniards failed to follow up their early expeditions with the establishment of any real settlements, the French managed to do it without even intending to. It all started in the late 1600s, when a French nobleman by the name of Robert Cavalier de la Salle decided to explore along the Mississippi River with the purpose of finding a way to create a better buffer between France's North American territories and those belonging to Spain. Stumbling across the Gulf of Mexico, La Salle would soon claim the whole of the Mississippi River Valley.
I love how European explorers just stumbled across these massive, very important things by accident. So, like, Columbus stumbled across the Americas. This dude stumbles across the Gulf. It's quite impressive.
For France. After returning to France, he then attempted to convince the king to set up a settlement at the mouth of the Mississippi to help fend off the nearby Spaniards, in addition to trying to convert more of the indigenous population to French Christianity. When King Louis XIV finally gave his approval, La Salle was sent back to begin the colony. Navigational faults would eventually lead La Salle to instead create a settlement further west off the coast of Mexico. But this colony would scarcely survive 3 years before finally succumbing to incursions from the natives, disease, and other difficulties.
Yeah.
The Spanish would soon hear of the French colony nonetheless, and decided that they should remove this thorn which has been thrust into the heart of America. However, the Karankawa and disease had already done so for them. Realizing the collapse of France's settlement, and the possibilities now to found a Spanish one, Alonso de Leon was sent off to first establish a mission in eastern Texas in 1690. This launched a period of on-off interest in Texas by Spain, as clashes with the natives seemed to continuously dissuade the Spaniards from doing much more. Real efforts.
It is just insane how much of the American continent Spain managed to get hold of, or particularly Spain and Portugal. I mean, between them, virtually the entire of South America, Central America, the Caribbean, and even big chunks, in Spain's case, of North America, before obviously France and Britain eventually kind of dislodged them a bit.
Appeared to only come in the early 18th century, after a Franciscan missionary attempted to seek support from the French for establishing new missions in Texas. Spain would almost immediately move to reoccupy the territory and keep the French out, which they did fairly well. At least, they were better at defending themselves from the French than from the local indigenous. Though still at odds with various local tribes, in 1762...
I mean, this so often happens in history. Like, one power expands not necessarily because it wants to, but because it's scared that if it doesn't expand, its rival will take the territory.
Spain was finally able to convince the French to relinquish all claims to the Texas territory at the end of the 7 Years' War. The Mexican War of Independence would secure much of Spain's former North American colonies as the new state of Mexico in 1821. Texas would be part of this infant country, and the Mexican government quickly blasted open the door for immigration as they hoped to bring in more settlers to counteract the effects of the angry natives. But with the growing population also came growing...
Yeah, I mean, imagine if Mexico had stayed this big. Like, the world history would be so different.
Unrest. By 1836, a new Texas government was formed, and a declaration of independence from Mexico followed. The new Republic of Texas would host the infamous Battle of Alamo in short order, a bloody massacre of Texas defenders that lit a passion under many Texans who were now even more determined to fight the Mexicans. The Texas Revolution.
So, particularly, if you know more about this than me, particularly, I guess, if you live in Texas, was it right that there were a lot of immigration from kind of Anglo Americans or from the United States to the Mexican territory of Texas prior to the Revolution, and that the people carrying out the Texas Revolution were essentially Anglo Americans from the States? Because that was my understanding, but they didn't mention anything in this video, so I might be wrong. Also, I found it kind of interesting that like the Alamo is such an iconic event because it's so like in British history where there's this love of the glorious failure. So like something like the Charge of the Light Brigade or like Captain Scott dying trying to find the South Pole. It's not the victory you celebrate; it's the glorious defeat.
Subsequently would be successful in the end, although the independence fighters opposing what they saw as the tyrannical rule of Mexico soon voted in favor of becoming a part of the United States. Ironically, the latter didn't even want Texas at first. Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren shot down the idea initially, but pressure from Great Britain for Texas to remain sovereign frankly pushed the Americans towards annexation. Finally,
Wait. So the United States decided it wanted Texas just because Britain wanted Texas to remain independent. That is crazy. I genuinely did not know that was the case.
in 1845, both Congresses approved the move, and Texas thus became a state of the USA. This, not surprisingly, triggered discord between America and Mexico over territorial disputes.
And I had no idea that the Americans initially were not keen on Texas joining. I just assumed that Texas was kind of welcomed into the arms of the United States, but by the sound of things, that wasn't the case at all. And it was only kind of geopolitical rivalry which led Texas to be allowed in.
That would initiate the start of the Mexican-American War. Though, in the end, Mexico would technically receive money in exchange for the full American ownership of Texas as well as other ceded territories, there wasn't much of an option left by the time the war was over.
Yeah.
Originally, Texas had actually laid claim to these additional ceded territories, which are now part of modern-day Colorado, Wyoming, Kansas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico. But Texas would eventually...
I mean, it's a crazy amount of land to gain in one war. Like in Europe, you could have a war where like a few 100,000 people die and maybe like one or two towns on the border change hands. And then in America, you have a war where probably, I mean, I don't know that much about the Texan American War, but I don't think it was that deadly. I think it's probably thousands killed, not sort of hundreds of thousands. And then like a big chunk of the North American continent switches hands.
Relinquish these claims to the federal government with a compromise of 1850, and barely over a decade later, in a drastic turn of events, Texas chose to leave the United States entirely. With the Civil War coming ever closer, a period of panic erupted in Texas, becoming known as the Texas Troubles. There had been rumors of enslaved people suddenly starting fires throughout the state, which led to lynching mobs and a heavier push against the abolitionist beliefs of the Union. This would eventually push Texas to hold a vote concerning secession from the United States.
This is kind of like bleeding Kansas, sort of the low-level political violence that preceded the Civil War.
Which found a whopping 76% of Texans in favor of leaving.
Wow.
As a result, Texas officially seceded and instead decided to join the Confederate States of America, a drastic change from its prior pleas to be annexed. Throughout the war, Texans who even still loosely supported or wished to be part of the Union faced severe consequences for their dissension, particularly those of the German and Mexican districts, and in Cook County in particular. In the latter, over 100 Union supporters were arrested, while over 60 of those were executed.
Oh, wow.
Civil War Texas was
That's
plagued
brutal.
with such massacres of Unionists, and even after the Emancipation Proclamation and Juneteenth marked the end of hostilities in one form, it also triggered a new wave of violence and outrage from Confederate veterans. Nevertheless, Texas would officially rejoin the United States of America on March 30th, 1870. The following phase of Texas's history marked a time of difficult reconstruction. Racial divides caused the once 90% black Republican Party in Texas to lose power to the white Democrats. This also coincided with a new movement within the Republican Party that aims to remove the freed slaves from power in the party, with all of this reflecting the overall ongoing racial conflict throughout the former Confederate state.
I mean, yeah, I know it's one of those weird things, but it always amazes me how strong the Democrats used to be in kind of the Deep South in like the 50s and 60s, and then kind of the Republicans almost replaced them. So the two, I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm getting this wrong, but as an outsider, it almost feels like the two parties kind of flipped, and Republicans became the Southern Conservatives rather than the Democrats.
These challenges would stretch into the 20th century as Texas struggled to stabilize itself socially within the Union. Hurricanes, drought, and the JFK assassination would additionally plague the great state of Texas over the next century, making it a tough ride for Texans still.
Wow, that was really interesting. Honestly, the biggest thing I didn't know was that the United States was not initially keen to annex Texas because I kind of think of Texas as being almost the iconic American state. So in the same way, like the Dallas Cowboys are America's team, Texas is the American state. If you had to encapsulate America in one state, I'd be tempted to go for Texas. But by the sound of things, that could very easily not have been the case. We could have had a completely different history with like an independent Texas competing probably with the United States for influence in the Caribbean and Central America. So that was really interesting. But no, I really enjoyed that. I would love to visit Texas at some time. That is definitely on my bucket list. It's quite a long bucket list, not going to lie, but it's on the list. I hope you enjoyed that. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe and link to the original video in the description. Go show them some love. Enjoy the rest of your day.